You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property under laws they had no part in making?
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 473 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, covering the coronavirus outbreak, the U.S. government is looking to exploit it to overthrow the Maduro government, but it's also impacting the U.S. military now with outbreaks on ships. And I'm also looking at what's going on here in the U.S. with abuses by the federal government, states government, local police forces as they look to enforce, dictates and, different mandates they put in place because of the coronavirus. I have some news on Afghanistan and where we are in negotiations between the Taliban and Afghan government, and updates on North Korea, who carried out another missile test. All right, everybody, share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I am the news editor of the Libertarian Institute, and I write the daily news roundup. Both the roundup and the show could be found on the homepage. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. I typically do 3 shows a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I did do a bonus show last week where I talked to Stephen Clyde about the $2 trillion bailout. Even though it's not necessarily a foreign policy topic, it was important enough and had me mad enough that I had to come on and do a show about it, so make sure you check that out if you haven't already. And lastly, you donated to the show over at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so first up, starting here at home with the reaction to the coronavirus. Looking at the local level, you have the New York Police Department that's actively using drones. Now, these aren't, I'm sure, armed Reaper or Predator drones or anything like that, but they're using different kind of, surveillance drones and flying over to parts to make sure people are appropriately social distancing. I think this is a disturbing level of surveillance by the police that you don't want them hovering drones over parts. And this is the kind of thing that they're going to vote to say, look how good the surveillance was. Nobody complained about it. So, after the coronavirus outbreak is over, maybe they continue to fly these drones over parts in the names of, fighting the drug war or preventing other kinds of crime. Looking at the state level, you have the governor of Rhode Island waging a very interesting campaign against New York State. Essentially, she has said that she couldn't close the border with New York State, but it did sound like she had discussed that possibility in the way she said it. Rhode Island police are pulling over anyone with a New York license plate and ask what they're doing in the state, and they're also going door to door with the Rhode Island National Guard to make sure that if, anybody from New York is in Rhode Island, that they're following a 14-day mandatory quarantine. So it's absolutely crazy, that this is able to go on. And it's not like anything's been passed or there's been a real discussion of, we want this to happen. I've lived in quite a few states where it's been on the border of another state. So whether St. Louis being very close to Illinois, the area of Wisconsin I was in being like a suburb of Chicago, New Hampshire, a lot of people commuting down to, Massachusetts, a lot of people cross state lines for a lot of reasons. And, it's not going to be a great thing if we just have these governors cracking down and closing borders. And, the people, not having any discussion of is concerning. And it seems like it's all being just done by dictate. On the federal level, we have Donald Trump invoking the Defense Production Act to force GM to make ventilators. I am going to try to find out a little bit more on this story as to what the Trump administration is doing or willing to do to compel GM to make these parts and why GM didn't want to make the parts. As I've mentioned on the show, from the very beginning, the place I was really concerned with the coronavirus in the United States. And while the situation, we now have over, 3,000 deaths. And so it's serious that people are dying with the coronavirus. But I think still the real place where there's a possibility to have a lot of people die is in prison. And so apparently there's an outbreak now in the Rikers prison in New York where overall in the federal prison system, 400 people have tested positive, although I'm sure that there's not many testing resources that are being diverted to, go to prisoners. If there's a shortage of tests and then somebody writes a story in the local paper saying that the governor or the mayor of the town decided to give a couple hundred tests to the prison rather than the local hospital, well, people are going to be outraged. So the politics we're facing here are pretty tough. But I think the right solution would be just to try to release especially as many non-violent offenders as possible. We're seeing countries like Iran and Turkey releasing massive amounts of prisoners right now. And I think that's, the correct way to try to, reduce the prison population. You got more room in the prisons. That means you have, less prisoners to treat overall, but hopefully then less contamination. It's easier to ice stuff like. We have had the first federal inmate confirmed to have died now from coronavirus. There's an interesting article in Newsweek, and this isn't the most libertarian point to make, but it is interesting just to look at the situation and realize that even with the level of federal spending we had, if we diverted more of that towards the medical sector, well, it's not going to make it perfect, and government intervention in medicine isn't necessarily the right thing. But just looking with the cost of, carrying, maintaining, and building nuclear weapons this year, the U.S. could have an additional 300,000 IC beds, tens of thousands of ventilators, and then pay, I think it was like 150,000 nurses and 75,000 doctors. And so to understand, that there are those like offset costs with the nuclear weapons isn't something that is often brought up. I think is really important that because we decide to spend the money on that, it wasn't freed up to do things. And some of that may have been going to the medical sector, which, looking at the time of the pandemic, I think we all would have won. The Department of Defense had signed a contract with the company at the beginning of the year to acquire 1,400 ventilators. I guess the Army needs ventilators. They have, casualties on the battlefield and they need them on ships. And the U.S. Army is so big. So it doesn't surprise me that they're buying ventilators, but they did increase that contract now to needing 8,000. This is something that when you're looking at there's a limited supply of ventilators. It's just, the way economics works. There's not a bazillion of them that could be handed out right now. And so that means, people are bidding on them and there's competition for ventilators. And so the U.S. Army buying more of them means, there's less to go around for the rest. And had we not have all of our troops deployed overseas, then we wouldn't need to buy so many ventilators because, maybe we have Army reservists, but they're all at home. And so they go to the civilian hospital. There's not a reason for this massive army that has bases in scores of countries and 200,000 troops deployed across the world. Because then when you do have a pandemic, you have a problem that you have troops in all these, you essentially have to quarantine them. And then you have all these aircraft carriers and other kinds of ships where you can't quarantine. In fact, it seems that the USS Theodore Roosevelt, one of our nuclear powered aircraft carriers, is in fairly desperate need. It's docked right now in Guam. They've had 100 tests positive on the ship. And the captain of the ship is saying he doesn't have anywhere to put the people who need to be quarantined. And so, to have the number of ventilators you need on that ship is probably going to be a disproportionate, number compared to if they were in a civilian hospital somewhere. And so, we're seeing resources taken away from the U.S. because we have this global empire. The last time I saw numbers out of the Pentagon for confirmed cases in the DOD, it was 560, and that was put out over the week. The first DOD personnel, it was an Army captain assisting the New Jersey National Guard, was the first person to have died in the DOD from coronavirus. The Department of Homeland Security has discussed a plan to deploy another 1,500 troops, U.S. forces on the northern and southern border. That's 1,000 to the northern border and 500 to the southern border. The Canadians issued a sharp and very vocal reaction to this, saying it was completely unacceptable and they strongly oppose it. I guess, the Canadians have a good idea of what U.S. foreign policy is and how governments work, and understand that, when we're talking about all of these things, whether it's New York police spying on people in parts, the wanting to use like the metadata from cell phones to see if people are appropriately social distancing and all that. These are things that, while they may be rolled back some once this coronavirus emergency is eventually over, are not going to be completely back. I read an interesting story on how Trump's tariffs on China are preventing the makers of Purell, which is Gojo Industries, from, making Purell more efficiently. There are tariffs on one of the products that they need, that they import from China. They had previously applied to the U.S., now before the coronavirus outbreak, but they applied to the government to be able to have an exemption here. They're making a medical product, and that was denied. So, just a couple of things to point out. That, the trend here is that government is screwing up. They told people not to wear masks. They prevented companies from testing because they didn't have FDA approval. they're overreacting and seizing powers of surveillance that they shouldn't. They're enforcing broad quarantines that shouldn't be going on. And so, this isn't a case where government's a solution. It's the case where government's the problem to, a natural occurrence, and it's exacerbated worse. On the global scale, this is happening as well. Apparently, Hungary's president has gotten quite a blank check from that country's legislator to rule with whatever kind of authority he says he needs to be able to combat the coronavirus. How long those emergency powers last beyond the coronavirus, I'm sure will be extensive, and he will do a lot to benefit himself politically. In Israel, you have government using surveillance programs that previously had only been directed towards Palestinians, but are now also being used to enforce quarantines and monitor and track Israelis who have tested positive for coronavirus. Netanyahu has also exploited this in a couple of other ways. One is he shut down the courts, or at least the portion of the courts that were handling indictments. And so since, he was facing his indictment hearings or whatever, his trial has been postponed. He also used the coronavirus to lure his political opposition, Benny Gantz, into agreeing to a coalition government where Netanyahu will rule first for 18 months before, saying he's then going to hand over power to Benny Gantz. This move completely fractured Benny Gantz's party, with I think about 2/3 of the party then moving away from Gantz because really it was an anti-Netanyahu coalition. It seems to me that this is the win that Netanyahu needed, and in 18 months' time we'll see if he gives up power, but my guess is he'll at least try to pull some strings to retain power. And I think this will also help him defeat the corruption charges. We've seen countries like Australia and France deploy their militaries to their streets to enforce quarantines. Of course, China had a huge crackdown and initially tried to suppress the story. And so we're seeing this all over. It's important to remember that when we're sacrificing these rights, we don't even know how long this, crisis, the coronavirus, some people are predicting could be around for 18 months. Do you really want to be living under a military enforced quarantine for 18 months? That's a discussion we should have. Also, nobody's, saying, which I think is extremely important, is what conditions need to be met for the government to start to lift restrictions. I think this is especially an important discussion to have as, not to sound like a Fox News watcher, but the left-wing media in the United States seems hell-bent on making sure it doesn't happen because and I know Donald Trump isn't handling this with any kind of tact at all. And I've said that the U.S. government screwed up and has made this outbreak worse. But, Donald Trump talking about getting the country back to normal and getting the economy back going, I think is a discussion that we need to be having is, what conditions are we looking for? What kind of numbers are we looking for in order to start opening things back up? To make sure that the government doesn't hold on to these powers too long, and claim the crisis is going on longer. Look, elections have already been postponed and held up. So if that's the standard set by the coronavirus, we sure as hell need to know what, conditions need to be in November to make sure that, the election moves. A UN human rights expert called for sanctions to be lifted against North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Cuba, noting that the sanctions against these countries are impacting their ability to respond to the coronavirus. All right, in a couple of non-coronavirus stories, the Pentagon is looking to make their 5-year budget projections classified information. This is just another blow to transparency, trying to keep the Pentagon budget. It's not in check. It's spiraling out of any kind of reasonable standard now. But to have more ability to look and say that this is what you forecasted, why are you asking so much more? That needs to be available to the public. All right, so let's talk about Venezuela now, where pretty explicitly the U.S. government is trying to exploit the coronavirus in order to have a regime change happen in Venezuela. The same thing is going on in Iran, but I want to specifically talk about the Venezuela situation today. Now, the first thing I want to mention that I think if the situation was Hong Kong was suffering and China had imposed sanctions and the Chinese government was telling Hong Kong they need to abandon the one country, two systems policy and just come under direct rule from Beijing in order to have sanctions lifted because Hong Kong had a serious outbreak of coronavirus. People would be rightly outraged, and that's the kind of move that would get a leader potentially really demonized, and in the way like Saddam or Gaddafi was, Osama bin Laden style. This person is pure evil. So I think that's important context to understand when we're talking about this. Imagine if China was doing it to Taiwan or North Korea. So last week, the U.S. unveiled an indictment against Maduro and a dozen or so more upper-level Venezuelan officials claiming they are narco-traffickers who have worked with the Colombian rebel group FARC to bring cocaine to the United States. So there's a lot of issues with this. One is to remember back to 1989, and there's a really good article by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on this, of how the U.S. Put these kind of charges against Noriega, who was the president of Panama, and then used that as an order to send in some troops, kill some people, and essentially kidnap and imprison Noriega. So this is a fairly serious move. Now, I think if you look at the difference between Panama under Noriega and Maduro now, it seems like how just the size of Venezuela, and the amount of support that Maduro has, the backing of Russia and China, and to the fact that they've had military personnel in Venezuela, and I think would deploy military personnel to Venezuela if the U.S. really tried to overthrow Maduro like that, makes it seem less likely that kind of operation would be attempted by at this point. However, it certainly doesn't mean that they won't do it, and it's very important to make sure that we're staying watchful. And if that seems like it's happening, try to prevent it, because it would be absolutely disastrous. With the indictment, the U.S. also issued a $15 million reward for the capture or information leading to the conviction of Maduro. It doesn't seem like, this is really changes anything as far as the movement the U.S. has had to try to overthrow Maduro the past year or more now of the Trump administration. Another interesting part of the indictment is that a Venezuelan general who, was under Chavez, and then when Maduro took over, kind of fell out of, favor with the government, and eventually defected and fled the country, for Colombia next door, was named in this indictment. And so, for the long time, the U.S. goal here in Venezuela has been to try to lure high-level military leaders to defect, and even offering them money. And here's a situation where one of them left the Maduro government and then was indicted. So I think this probably undermines the U.S. policy in Venezuela, and I'm not sure how if it's just a mistake, if it's incompetent, or if they maybe don't want the indictment to really work, and this is just another excuse for, well, we tried all these other things, so all we could do now is go in and overthrow Maduro. Now, in response to the indictment from the U.S., the Venezuelan government charged Juan Guaido with, trying to form a coup and overthrow Maduro. Now, he's obviously tried to do this. It's been barely public and backed by the United States. And in fact, he's been allowed to do it for well over a year in Venezuela with some harassment, but he's generally remained out of prison the entire time. Isn't something that you would expect to see in many countries, especially one, with a dictator like government. Now, I will say, I'm saying a lot here that the U.S. shouldn't overthrow Maduro. I don't necessarily want the Venezuelan people to suffer under his ridiculous and foolish socialist communist system. But I think the U.S. getting involved with the level of sanctions that they have that is now prolonging and exacerbating the Venezuelan, not only just day-to-day suffering, but now with the coronavirus, making that even work is very problematic. It's probably going to rally people to the support of their government, like we've seen in the United States and several other countries, where leaders who maybe don't have the highest records are having high numbers of, support in polling because of the coronavirus outbreak. The general that was named in the indictment did turn himself into I'm not sure what the overall plan there is. But then the U.S. just today the last day of March the 31st, the U.S. unveiled a new policy for Venezuela that says if Maduro steps down and allows the National Assembly, which is the opposition-controlled legislature, to appoint a new president for 6 to 12 months and then elections will be held, the U.S. would ease sanctions against Venezuela. Now, it's not clear to what extent sanctions against Venezuela would be. The U.S. did say that Maduro would be allowed to run in the election, although it doesn't say that if he wins, what would be the difference, and then would the U.S. reapply sanctions, and so this is really all pointless and futile. It's an obvious effort to exploit the coronavirus situation in Venezuela to try to overthrow Maduro again. What Venezuela needs right now is for the U.S. to lift sanctions for the U.S., hopefully permanently, but at least in the short term, to put any regime change efforts on hold and allow Venezuela to figure out a way to, get through this coronavirus outbreak with as few people dying as possible. All right, talking about North Korea real quick here. We have the North Koreans launching another test round of short-range missiles. This is, I think, their 4th test and their 8th or 9th missile tested this month. Those are highs, although it doesn't seem to me that any of these tests are particularly significant. So while people are making a lot of noise about it, saying that, this level of testing is unprecedented, it's not like North Korea is testing new nuclear weapons or ICBM. Kim Jong-un this week put out a statement saying that the U.S. isn't interested in nuclear negotiations, and so I think the missile tests are reflective of, what North Korea sees as the reality, that the Trump administration isn't going to negotiate with them on any reason. In Afghanistan, we have the Taliban putting together a 21-person negotiation, and then the Taliban refusing to meet with the negotiation team, claiming it wasn't inclusive. I'm still trying to find out more details on if there's an issue of a particular person within the Afghan negotiating team the Taliban has. There's 5 women on the team. Is that an issue? And then, what representation does Abdullah have in the team in it? Is that maybe the Taliban issue with there not being enough or any representatives from, his presidential administration that he claimed? So with the negotiations not moving forward, the Afghan government put out that the prisoner swap or the prisoner release is on hold, and there's been a few attacks where the Afghan government raided some Taliban positions, and the Taliban have raided some Afghan government positions, with at least 27 Afghan government soldiers being killed. Now, the Taliban today did send a 3-man negotiation team to Kabul to begin the process. It was supposed to be 10 people, but that was scaled down because of the coronavirus. All right, so in the Middle East here, we have 3,000 U.S. paratroopers in limbo. They were deployed to the Middle East earlier this year, amid heightened tensions with Iran after the Soleimani assassination. And, their job was to quote unquote deter Iran. When in reality, unfortunately, these soldiers likely just became another target for the Iranian in the Middle East. Those soldiers are now scheduled to come home, but there is a 60-day period issued by Secretary of Defense Mark Esper on troop movements, saying we're not going to have any right now. So for that reason, they may not be coming home. You also have the commander of CENTCOM, General Kenneth McKenzie, asking the Pentagon to extend their stay in the Middle East. So for one reason or another, it looks like those 3,000 soldiers will continue to be in, the Middle East and not with their family during a very difficult period for completely unnecessary reasons. All right, so in Syria, we have 2 anti-Assad factions. You have the Syrian Kurds, who are not Sunni jihadist extremists, and they have been backed by the U.S. Department of Defense. And then you also have the, jihadist opposition, the Syrian rebels, the Free Syrian Army, the Turkish-backed, formerly CIA-backed, Saudi-backed, Qatari-backed opposition to Assad. And, they have their fighting groups like HTS, but they are also allied with the White Helmets, which claims to be a civilian rescue team, and I'm sure they have pulled some people out of rubble throughout this war, but are also a propaganda organization. So the Syrian Kurds are asking for Washington, lobbying for the sanctions on Syria to be repealed in order to allow more medical and aid to come into the country, more trading. That way we could start, the rebuilding and recovery process from the Syrian civil war that has been resolved in most areas of the country at this point. But also, the corona outbreak is reaching Syria, and it's going to be very problematic for that country, especially if they're prevented in the kind of supplies they're able to buy by the sanction. Whereas the white helmets, so the jihadist bad side, those guys are saying, no, you got to keep the sanctions on. Assad is so evil, when in reality, they're also very allied with. So I read this story that I thought had a few interesting pieces to it, and I want to talk about. There was a riot in a prison somewhere in Syrian Kurdish controlled territory. A few people, the U.S. Says that only low-level ISIS offenders were at the prison, escaped in that riot, and also some people were murdered in that riot. And now, so the U.S. makes it sound like they're only jihadists, but then local people are reporting that these are people who are thrown in jail for failing to comply with the Syrian Kurdish demand that they all conscripted to the government. And so it's very disturbing. Then the U.S. is tied to the Syrian Kurds, who are relying on conscription to get fighters to do their bidding. And if not, they're jailing them potentially with ISIS fighters. Seems like a very dangerous situation. The U.S. has been repositioning troops in Iraq, and I've talked about this on the show. I had Will to talk about it on the show. But apparently, the U.S. government is also pushing, at least factions in the U.S. government, and this would be the, Pompeo-Esper faction, are pushing for the U.S. to wipe out complete Hezbollah, a Shia militia in Iraq that has a relationship with Iran, and they want the U.S. to wipe it out. The U.S. commander of forces in Iraq, Lieutenant General White, issued a memo to the White House saying that we absolutely can't do this. I would need thousands of more troops. It would undermine the fight against ISIS, and it would provoke a fight with Iran. So very awesome that we have a general at that level standing up and saying no to a military operation. The U.S. has deployed at least one Patriot missile system now to Iraq, and they're trying to deploy 2 more. I do worry about the U.S. Repositioning troops in Iraq. It seems like they're putting all the U.S. troops in bases that they're trying to deploy these Patriot batteries to. And does that mean, that this is part of a build-up to some kind of strike either against Iran or complete Hezbollah in Iraq? It's also important to remember that this may not just provoke a fight with Iran, which I'm sure it would, at least if nothing else, escalate in the proxy war that's been happening between the U.S. and Iran, but could provoke a lot of resentment from Iraqis who understand that complete Hezbollah was a very important group in the fight against ISIS and liberated a lot of people from their very terrible rule. In Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, we have Saudi Arabia dropping tons of bombs on the capital city there of Sana'a, killing at least 70 horses and 1 civilian. They also hit a school in the presidential palace. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you share it. Find it online at the Libertarian Institute. Follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE. Join up the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, and donate at patreon.com/foreignpolicy.